This time last year, Syrians poured into the streets to celebrate the fall of Bashar Al Assad. After 14 years of civil war and 5 decades of the Assad family rule, it was an emotional moment, to say the least. What had started as a revolutionary movement during the 2011 uprisings turned into a devastating war. Opposition groups and regime forces battled for power. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and millions of people were displaced. The country descended into economic despair. Water, electricity, and essential services are still lacking today. In December 2024, when rebel forces led by Hayat Tahrir Al Sham, a group formerly part of Al-Qaeda, toppled the government in less than 2 weeks, it came as a shock. They had seized Aleppo, then Daraa, the birthplace of the uprising, then the capital Damascus. Bashar Al Assad and his entourage fled to Russia. It was euphoric for Syrians who opposed Assad's reign, many of them who have lived for years in exile. Hope for the future finally felt within reach. The HTS leader traded his fatigues for suits and his nom de guerre Abu Muhammad al-Jolani for his new role as President Ahmad Al Shara. Internationally, he was widely accepted. In a stunning turn of events, he met with US President Donald Trump and the former CIA Director David Petraeus, whom he once fought against in Iraq. But 1 year later, has the honeymoon phase ended? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al Tahir. In this episode marking the 1-year anniversary of Assad's fall, we look at how Ahmad Al Shara has been doing so far. We also try to answer the burning question: is Syria better off today? Joining me in today's conversation is Charles Lister, Director of the Syria Program at the Middle East Institute, and Rahaf Al-Dougli, Assistant Professor at Lancaster University. Welcome to you both. Rahaf, I do want to start the conversation with you, and where it started a year ago. A conversation about hope. When Bashar al-Assad was pushed out of power, that moment was a little bit surreal. And there was a feeling of hope that people hadn't felt for 14 years. So I want to ask you, a year later, is that feeling still there, do you think, among the people? Or are they now starting to realize their new reality and are sort of beginning to sober up?
It cannot be the same euphoric moments of collective happiness, joy, and relief that we initially witnessed when Assad first fell. I think we are now heading towards more of a cautious optimism, and that's understandable. That's very much understandable, actually, in a context of like a very newly, freshly like country getting out of an entrenched war and very much fragmented geography. So we have also fragmented optimism, and that's kind of varies widely across the country. And actually, what's more important, perhaps asking hope for whom, because we are now not speaking for a more of unified Syrians. So as the geography of Syria that's now contested among northeast and the southern of Syria, with Syria is also very incredibly diverse and also fragmented. And I do resist reducing them into, for example, simple sectarian or ethnic categories. But I can say that even Sunnis, some of the Sunnis, we see deep-seated grievances among Sunnis themselves. So it's not, again, the Sunni Alawi or the Sunni Druze or the Druze tribe versus Bedouins. Among all of these shifting sentiments around these categories, we see sharp divisions in terms both horizontally and vertically. And I think Al Shara's populism, if I may say, hinges on these contradictions because in each group we see that they lean towards Al Shara for more unifications, or when in moments where we are facing existential threats, Sunnis have felt that in the last year, the Druze felt the same, and then they lead towards their sub-state identity. So it's in that turmoil, it's very much kind of predictable that we see these kind of high and low emotions.
Exactly. And we're going to get into the sectarian divide. But Charles, I do want to ask you, there's a challenge, which is exactly what Rahaf was talking about. The sectarian violence in coastal areas, revenge killings we've been seeing, clashes between Druze and government-aligned militias in Sweden. And all of that in itself is a problem and has birthed even more divisions. Do you think that Al Shara's government could have done more to stop all of this from happening? And do you think that there's something that they could do to fix the situation?
I think a lot of what's happened over the last 11 months or so, when we're talking about quote unquote sectarian violence, a lot of it has been much more to do with politics than it has been to do with sect. And then, yes, we can certainly argue that over 14 years of civil conflict and more than half a century of Assad rule, that lines on the map, dare I say it, or lines through or across or between communities have been drawn along sectarian lines. Yes, and it would certainly be, a lie to deny that there isn't sectarianism in Syria. There really is. I got to say, when I first went into Syria in January, not long after the fall of the regime, some of the most vitriolic sectarianism I heard came from minorities directed at other minorities. So it's also not just this kind of dualistic Sunni versus everybody else either. Yeah. There's intra-Sunni tensions, there's intra-Alawite tensions, there's intra-Druze tensions. But also a lot of it is guided by politics, questions of federalism, questions of secession, questions of secularism, questions of, Islam and its role in society. And so I think we should be paying more attention to politics than I think exacerbating. Yes, existing sectarian tensions, but they're not determinant of everything we've seen. And as to your question about the government, I don't think there is a human being alive today who could have managed with the thousands of lines of hostility, suspicion, paranoia, historical grievances, intercommunal tensions. So I think that there is plenty of room for blame for the government's failure, for example, to early on demonstrate cohesive command and control when it comes to responding to some of those early incidents. But that's not Ahmad Al Shara's fault, for example. No actor taking over Damascus after 14 years of civil war and 50 years of dictatorship was ever going to be in a position to do any of those things. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be expecting more from the transitional government. We should be every single day, but we also need to be very realistic about what we should be expecting 11, 12 months into an extraordinarily fragile transition in a country that is just riven with gigantic structural, social, religious, political challenges. And so we have to just temper our expectations.
Rahaf, when we spoke about all of this a year ago and looking ahead, you were also concerned that Al Shara would focus on building external ties before focusing on reuniting the country internally, as we were just mentioning. Looking now at how much Ahmad Al Shara has unlocked on an international level for Syria in terms of removing sanctions, construction aid pledges, restoring diplomatic ties, do you still have the same concerns that he's looking outwards? Because surely, as important as it is to rebuild the country, it is important too to improve its image internationally.
I cannot answer this question without linking it back to the previous one, because I think it's, while it's well, I do agree partially with Charles on that. It's difficult to say that any leader could have fully prevented the relapse into violence, given the structural fragmentations of Syria. But actually, to link it to your question now, I think, yes, there were critical missed opportunities internally or inwardly where Al Shara could have improved it and actually avoided some of these massacres that happen on the coast and in Suwaida. And part of this is when, for example, the focus of Al Shara has been mostly on lifting the sanctions on one hand and also delisting HTS on the other, and then working towards building relations with various axes in globally and regionally. And all of this kind of manifested in the very hasty process of integrating the different or the various armed groups. I think part of this obsessiveness with looking outwards were also more reflected in the missing opportunities into trying to unify these armed groups so they are more apt to respond to any security threats. And also, I think the very quick and hasty national dialogue, the way that the constitutional declaration was announced, the announcement of the visual identity, the Syrian identity, where also there are like geographies, Syrian geographies are completely excluded. I think there should have been more efforts and at least symbolic junctures from the government where they are building trust between these diverse communities. And I'm talking about pre the violence in the coast in March and again in July in Suwaida. I think there has been some missed opportunities there where we could have built social and political consensus among Syrians before just calling for the West or having that external legitimacy hovering over Syria.
But isn't that international legitimacy also crucial for rebuilding Syria?
I'm not quite, because, and we have Iraq as an example. The sanctions in Iraq, Iraq did not need to lift the sanctions. It has its own resources, but it relapsed into sectarian violence, in 2006 till 2008. I think while I've been always against sanctions, I never believed that sanctions can remove Assad regime. It would, in my opinion, it had hardened the illicit economies inside Syria, fragmented the society even more. Whilst removing sanctions is important, but building trust among the Syrian communities, it's harder task than building legitimacy externally. And we all know that the change in regional dynamics after the 7th of October lean towards Al Shara's rise to power. So I don't think he should be at all insecure about his legitimacy externally, but more or less needs now to look inward and how to prevent from any relapse into violence.
Charles, Rahaf just basically said or looked at the Iraq example in terms of sanctions. Right now, Syria is a country that is still facing some of the issues that it had in the past with regards to water and electricity. The situation may have improved slightly in some areas, but it's still overarchingly not great. There's decimated infrastructure, poor services, and all of that is deterring some of the Syrian refugees who had fled from returning. So where do you stand on this whole sanctions removal thing? Is it enough at this stage to just remove sanctions when many of the basics have yet to be restored?
Well, I think your question sort of answers itself. There's no chance, and there would never be a chance of restoring services and reconstructing the country if sanctions were still in place. So I think the fact that the sort of interim or transitional government focused so overwhelmingly on foreign policy in the early phases of the transition, yes, undercut its focus and attention domestically. And I think there's certainly questions to be asked, especially around the early phases of the transition, where certain activities became kind of box checking exercises rather than things of real substance. But if the government hadn't focused so significantly on foreign policy and on, especially given who these guys are, achieving international legitimacy and credibility, and yes, seeking to get the removal of sanctions, then the conversation we'd be having right now would be a hell of a lot more pessimistic. I mean, the idea that there have been cities in Syria over the past couple of weeks that for test periods got 24 hours of electricity a day would have been a complete fantasy if we hadn't seen the government focus on those foreign policy issues early on. So we are not in a place where all of Syria is going to be having 24 hours of electricity every day for the next 365 days. But we are in a place where certain areas of the economic infrastructure across the country have been rehabilitated or reconstructed in a way that would have been impossible had that foreign policy investment not happened very early on. So it's a double-edged sword. I don't think any transitional government would have had the capacity to focus at 100% speed on domestic and foreign. They made a gamble that they needed to invest in foreign, and they made a gamble that the domestic stuff could wait. Whether that was the right gamble, I think probably still remains to be seen. But we also cannot deny that on the foreign policy side, they have made achievements that I don't think any of us would have predicted 12 months ago. And that has unquestionably helped pave a path towards some form of a recovery. But we're certainly in like day one of that recovery right now. It's gone a long way to go.
There's been a lot of attention on what Al Shara is going to do with regards to Israel. Full normalization right now seems far-fetched, but now even just a disengagement agreement seems to be in jeopardy. We know that Israel's been launching attacks into Syria continuously. Benjamin Netanyahu toured southern Syria in a widely condemned move, and Israel is refusing to withdraw from areas that it occupied when Assad fell. It seems that Israel is undeterred by Al Shara's new relationship with Washington. They're not intimidated. So, do you think he has any real leverage at all when it comes to the threat of Israel? Does he even view Israel as a threat?
Personally, he is in a very difficult position, I think. Like we saw Israel war on Gaza, the genocide there. Who is going to stop Israel now? So I don't think Al Shara has so many leverages. The real gamble here, or what might happen next, is relies on Sueda and the Druze political awareness, I may say. It's about the political will of these people. And if these people are keep calling for Israel to intervene, then we are... The question of Israel or the Israeli threat is more about how Syrians are going to face other Syrians who are now leaning towards Israel. To what extent they would reject the project being imposed. I would love to believe that it's imposed on them currently, where we are seeing protests in the streets of Sweden in the last 2 days holding Netanyahu's and Al-Hajri photos. I believe that not so many Jews are in love of these kind of protests, but I think that their agency is a little bit now constrained. And I think the real threat towards Syria unity, or not only unity, the question of Israel and to what extent they can intervene more and more in Syria, it depends on the Syrian people and to what extent we are able to, I would say it in Arabic, رأب الصدع, which is, I couldn't find a translation in English for that, which is more or less having that dialogue again, building trust again with Sueda. This needs to break, and I'm against this kind of hierarchical, top-down kind of agreement between Jordan, America, and Al Shara. We need Bedouins and the Druze on the table. So I would love to keep the kind of questions about Israel is more of Israel as violating Syrian sovereignty. But when it has more of instrumentalized communities inside, here is the problem that becomes no longer about an enemy outside, but more of a fractured society inside, that if we want to face Israel, it's becoming Syrians facing Syrians, fighting each other. So here is the threat, the real threat.
So is my understanding that the unification of Syrians with regards to their position towards Israel is what can make a real difference?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Charles?
Yeah, I mean, well, let me first start on a couple of those points because I think they're really important. I mean, the first thing is that the first comprehensive national polling that has been undertaken in Syria for many years came out just a few months ago from the Arab Center. And one of the things that it found, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was an overwhelming majority of Syrians completely oppose any kind of a deal with Israel. So the first kind of interesting observation here is we're in a strange place where we have a transitional government that at the very top is led by, members of a former Al-Qaeda affiliate who I know for a fact are absolutely hell-bent determined to make a deal with Israel. And yet the population is far more skeptical. So that's a strange place for us to be in, but that is where we are. I know that from the president. I know that from the interior minister, the foreign minister, and the defense minister. They are all determined to make a security deal with Israel, not a peace deal. That is, as you say, way, way further down the line. So I think that's important for us to recognize. I think Rahaf makes a really good point that parts of the Syrian community have been instrumentalized or exploited, frankly, by, to be blunt, Israel's play right now, which is to keep Syria unstable, riven by division, and weak. At the moment, that's the Israeli calculation. Now, I know for a fact that not all Israelis feel that way. This is unique to Netanyahu's government. And we do have elections, not that too far away in the sort of historical calendar, which could, in theory, change that equation. But 12 months or so is a long time for Syria to continue to face the ground incursions, which is the real big problem here. I mean, on average right now, we're seeing 20 to 25 ground incursions every week into Syria. That is not a situation that Syria has any capacity to push back against. The second it did, they will give Israel all the ammunition they need to continue doing exactly what they're doing. So to your question about leverage, I do think the government in Damascus has real leverage here. I mean, the leverage is that basically the entire rest of the world, except ironically Iran and Israel, have unified around the idea that Syria's transition must succeed and that Syria must stabilize. Where else in the world, anywhere in the world, do we have the United States, Russia, China, Europe, the entire Middle East region, except Israel and Iran, and everyone in between completely unified behind a political transition? It just doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. That's the leverage that Shara and the government have, is that under this current leadership, which, to be honest, given where it stands on the foreign policy level, doesn't appear to be going away anytime soon, Syria's transition has to be allowed to succeed. And the language that the government has framed its economic recovery around gives it additional leverage. The idea that Syria can become a hub for more economic interconnectivity, more transactionalism across the region. I mean, this is the same language that the Gulf's been speaking, that the Trump administration's been speaking, that India and China have been speaking in the context of the Middle East. So that's the leverage. But the only thing that will change this equation with Israel is, in my opinion, President Donald Trump taking a decision to take this on personally. And he has demonstrated with Gaza, imperfectly, that he does have the capacity to change Netanyahu's calculations on things. But nobody's, as I understand, nobody has raised this issue with Trump personally and said, you need to fix this yet. But I would say we're at that time now where that does need to happen.
Rahaf, the government of Al Shara has shifted the influence of foreign power in Syria, and by extension, the region, to one that is more aligned with the West. Because we remember, obviously, Iran backing Bashar Al Assad. Its influence in Syria is no longer as strong as it was. And there is criticism, of course, against both camps. But could this change and this shift be at least promising when it comes to the security situation in Syria? To take, for example, with armed factions and the crackdown of the Captagon trade and ISIS, etc. There were lots of things that were being backed internationally. What do you make of this new shift towards the West?
I think it's important for Syria's history. I think this is the first time in Syria's history that we move towards like more of the Western camp. And then I see we are in a phase of a multipolarity, and I don't believe that we have a unipolarity in the world so far. And I think Al Shara has been clever in a way of positioning himself. He did visit Russia, and he kind of welcomed some technical assistance from them, and then also he seems very reliant on Saudi Arabia technical support in terms of the military. And of course, the US has its own history in Syria in deterring ISIS, and being on that coalition for Al Shara is important, especially if we are to face in the future more of a power sharing deal with SDF. That's more of and perhaps for another podcast to talk about whether power sharing is ever possible. But it's the first step. Now I do think as well that Al Shara is, because of his alliance or more or less positioning himself towards the US, he is facing more of an internal anger or dissatisfaction from the hardcore within his group. I did listen to some of these voices in Syria now, that it's more or less westernly whitewashed, and also from some Islamist groups that they believe that coalition is not very much trusted. So he is trying to find his way among all of these contradictories. But I think it's bringing Syria forward But the question is, will Russia sacrifice Syria? That's another question.
Yeah.
Because we have seen in the last few days these protests in on the coast. There has been some hopes that Russia could help and come and assist otherwise, and that's bringing the more of the proxyization or the same kind of landscape that we were facing during the Syrian conflicts, the proxyization and the instrumentalization of certain communities. We might see it along again, but Al Shara, with his leaning towards US, that might be a good step for Syria to recover from the Russia and Iranian interference.
Charles, do you have anything to add?
Only to say this very complicated balancing act between all these different international players. I mean, to an extent, it's impressive that it's been sustained for 12 months or nearly 12 months now. I have a question in my mind, which is how long it can be sustained forever. I mean, the world is a complicated place. I think, most of the past year has been a honeymoon period for Syria's transition, as these different, again, to emphasize, political demands for secession in Sweden, federalism in parts of the coast and parts of the northeast, or semi-autonomy or decentralization, as these various political demands or expectations begin to form and to begin to refine, then I think the honeymoon period will start to come to an end. And that doesn't mean Syria will fall into conflict, but it will mean that they won't find it quite so easy, for example, on the international level, to continue to be friends with everybody and not have to pick a side. In all of my conversations throughout the government, right to the very top, it's very clear that the US is the priority partner for a whole host of reasons. And I don't expect that to change. But, for example, we were just talking about Israel. The fact that a 50, 60 member Russian military delegation was just recently welcomed to Damascus and then driven down in a 15 vehicle convoy down to the Israeli controlled lines doesn't mean that Damascus has decided it no longer favors the United States, but it does mean that they have been forced to try to experiment with other options. Now, it just so helps that the Trump administration isn't really the kind of government to get angered by a partner also choosing to work with Russia. Now, if we had a Democratic administration here, we'd be having a very different conversation. But it served to show that things are going to get more complicated. Damascus is going to have to start picking and choosing here, there, and everywhere, whether we're talking domestically or in terms of foreign policy. And that will just make the situation a little bit more complicated.
And so the scales are going to tip to one side. Charles, I want to ask you quickly about accountability. A year may not be a very long time, but for the families of the forcibly disappeared Syrians under Assad, it has been an eternity, with them not knowing what has happened to their loved ones, and no accountability so far, no real pursuit of justice or any of the sort. And on the flip side, how can the government pursue this file without its own repressive crackdowns and without inciting vengeance against the perpetrators?
Hard to know which of those two questions to start with, because they feed into each other very much. I mean, on the latter side, vigilantism in Syria has, for the last 11 months, been the biggest source of deadly violence across Syria every single week for the last 11 months. So first of all, we all need to acknowledge, as I think you were suggesting, that these deeply held grievances, some of which go back to forcible disappearance, others of which go back to crimes otherwise committed during the conflict, and much of it also to pre-2011 developments in Syria, continues to be the primary driver of deadly violence every single week across Syria. So it is, in my mind, it is the biggest security priority, or it should be the biggest security priority for Damascus. And that encompasses a whole bigger conversation around transitional justice and accountability, and trying to move forward. The problem for me is really, really basic, which is a large number of people have been arrested for all number of sort of larger scale crimes. Dozens and dozens, if not several hundred regime officers have been detained over the last 11 months. But the Justice Ministry has struggled to vet, approve, then re-employ and pay salaries for judges. Full stop. Is literally that basic. So it's not that Damascus doesn't want to have a justice and accountability track. It's not that it doesn't want to have public trials, as we've seen for the first time in Aleppo regarding the coastal violence from March. But on a really basic level, the fact that Qatar is paying public sector salaries, and by the way, what they're paying isn't anywhere near enough to cover public sector salaries. It's a small help. Tells you a lot about the capacity of this transitional government to do loads of important things, including justice and accountability. So I have a very imperfect answer, which is it's going to be piecemeal. It's going to take time. And again, coming back to that question around prioritizing foreign policy and getting sanctions relief. If there wasn't a prioritization of foreign policy and getting sanctions relief, it would be impossible to consider justice and accountability in Syria, because you need professionally trained judges who expect a salary to come to work and work 7 days a week to process one case. And we're talking about hundreds of cases that are currently in the works.
I think I will add to Charles' answer on the lack of competence. And I do agree with that, but we are still seeing loyalty-based appointments everywhere in these institutions and in these ministries. So I think, yes, sanctions do have a big role on determining what's going to happen next for Syria, but also I think we do need that to build these institutions away from nepotism, cronyism, and what we are seeing now. It's very loyalty-based appointments. And this is happening in the military, and especially when I am seeing how the security sector reform is happening, I can see that most of these grievances are unaddressed because not only of old grievances, but the lack of competence and the lack and more of focusing on loyalty rather than technocrats or competence.
The kind of loyalty-based hiring of senior people is a problem, but it's also far from surprising after 14 years of brutal civil war, where the entire mindset is based around staying within your group. So the fact that, for example, at the Foreign Ministry, probably 80 to 90% of the mid-ranks who have been brought into the Foreign Ministry never had one iota of a relationship with HTS is encouraging. But to see that replicated across other ministries is going to take time. But frankly speaking, it also requires money. In the first 12 months, we had a rush of Syrians rushing back to do this. But now the honeymoon is over. It is going to require more incentives to bring people back.
I want to ask a question to you both, but I want to start with you, Rahaf. Is Syria better off today than it was a year ago?
Oh, well, definitely. Definitely without Assad, definitely. I mean, I don't want to sound like this. We have siege mentality still affecting all of us Syrians. We keep comparing everything now happening to what happened during Assad. And that's not healthy. I might say it is the siege mentality, but definitely.
Charles, do you think Syria is better off today than it was a year ago?
I mean, no question about it. I mean, on every single level, and I'm not Syrian, but on every metric, Syria is in a better place today than it was. And whilst I think cautious optimism is exactly the right description for today, we're not in the kind of, giddy excitement mode that we were 10 months ago, but cautiously optimistic. Is a hell of a good place to be, considering where we were 13 months ago when the world was a very dark place when it came to Syria.
Thank you so much, both of you. That's all we have time for, unfortunately, but it's been incredible, and we covered so much ground. So thank you so much, Charles, and thank you, Rahaf, for your time and insights. That's it for Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al Tahir. Thank you for listening.